Hello, teachers and pianists. Today we're talking about how to teach and play the Mozart Minuet in F major K.2. It sounds like this. This is probably Mozart's easiest piece to play, and it's delightful, well-known, students enjoy it, and it's very recognizable. I'm looking at this today in Jane McGraw's Classics Alive Book 1, which is the red Classics Alive. I also pulled out my Maurice Hinson At the Piano with Mozart. I love these books from the Alfred Masterworks edition because there's a lot of introductory material, background on the composer, how you might use articulation and ornamentation, all those kinds of things. So I do recommend those as student editions, or even for teachers who are seeking a little bit more information on performance practice and background about composers and things like that. I also pulled that out to look at it and found this quote, which I think is really apropos here. Hinson says that this may sound paradoxical, but I feel that Mozart's piano music is best described by saying that it is at the same time the most easy and the most difficult music to play correctly. And I have found in my over 20 years of teaching that this is very true. Mozart seems easy when you look at it on the page. It sounds simple when you listen to it. It's very right and ordered and clean and all of that. But to actually play it beautifully and expressively is surprisingly difficult. So if you've tried teaching Mozart and it's not going real well for you, that's totally fine. You're in good company. Hopefully I'll have a few tips for you today that will make it sound more beautiful and help you teach it the next time. This video was a request by one of my viewers, so if you have another piece or composer or anything that you'd like me to talk about in one of my upcoming videos, please do leave a comment below and I'd be glad to look at what you're interested in learning about. All right, so speaking of that difficulty, this is listed pretty low. It's definitely an early intermediate piece. On the RCM list, it's on level 1, and for my Illinois colleagues, this is on our AIM level 4. So it is considered early intermediate. It's not that difficult, but there are a number of things that our students have to do well in order to play it beautifully. All right, we're in F major, not a very difficult key. We do have some accidentals and some interesting dissonant notes because I think one of the main features of this piece is these appoggiaturas or non-harmonic tones that happen at the ends of phrases, such as measure 4, that E natural in the right hand against the left hand F. They're really juicy notes, and it's just so beautiful when they resolve after they've been dissonant for a moment. And sometimes students think they're playing the wrong thing. So it is important that you warn your students there are going to be some times of dissonance in this, and make sure they know that they can be confident. Yes, I'm reading an E in the right hand and an F in the left hand. Same thing in measure 12, the F sharp in the right hand, G in the left hand. It's so dissonant, that major 7th. I think major 7ths are one of the most dissonant intervals that we hear frequently. So it's very dissonant, but then the resolution is so beautiful. So just make sure your students are reading that correctly. Make sure they've listened enough times to know, yes, this dissonance is supposed to be here. All right, because this is a minuet, we are in 3/4 time, of course. The minuet is the only dance that survives past the Baroque era and retains its popularity in this time period. Mozart, Beethoven, Haydn, all those composers in the classical era continued to write minuets. So it's in a slightly more polyphonic style than a lot of other classical era music. The left hand definitely has an independence of its own line. So make sure your students are ready to play that, moving around. The beginning is pretty easy, but then you start really bouncing around. So students need to be confident of just not staying in one position, such as in a more chordal approach, but moving all around. And I tell my students that this is the minuet pattern. It's an octave on the outside with that dominant note in the middle, the 5th, and it usually goes down, but it can also go up. And And you find this in almost every minuet that has ever been written. So if a student can memorize that minuet pattern, know the intervals, know how it feels, and then say, oh, in measure 4, that's the minuet pattern on F. And in measure 8, that's the minuet pattern on C. It's actually a really great thing for them to be able to learn more quickly and not be thinking so much in individual notes as they get to the ends of those phrases. All right, the right hand, as far as how Mozart composed this, is made up of sequences. So a sequence is a little motive or pattern that's then moved around, same pattern, but moved to a new pitch. So it starts on F, then we have it slightly different on D, and then down on A, and then we get that appoggiatura. So whatever you decide your articulation is, and we're going to talk about articulation in just a moment, it needs to be the same throughout all of those sequences. The other thing I like to do with sequences is make sure that they don't always happen at the same dynamic level. So perhaps it grows a bit throughout the phrase, a little bit more, and a little bit more, going to that juicy E. I keep coming back to these appoggiaturas here because they are, I think, the main point of this piece. Sequences can otherwise get dull if they all kind of sound the same. And in addition to that, Mozart tends to write short little snippets of music, such as those 3 of the same sequence, that then make up a longer phrase. So students should realize that this is 4-bar phrases. It's not 1 measure, 1 measure, 1 measure, 1 measure, but it's one longer phrase that peaks at that dissonant appoggiatura note. So let's talk about articulation. One of the reasons I'm recommending these particular 2 editions, although you do see this piece in several older or not my favorite editions, is that articulation is something that editors like to put in without really clarifying that they've added slurs. Jane McGraw has added slurs. She has put these 3-note slurs on that opening sequence. Those are the only ones she's added. All the other editions I've looked at have the slur on those appoggiaturas, the non-harmonic tones in measure 4 and 8, and more like that. I agree with her articulation on this. I think it's nice. If you look at that Hinson edition that I recommended, this one with Mozart's face on it, there are very few slurs in there, just the appoggiaturas. So it's just helpful to know that oftentimes I find in older editions or less scholarly ones, there are extra slurs thrown in. One example of this is that minuet pattern that I was just talking about. Frequently you'll see a slur on that. I don't know that that's necessarily wrong. It actually would in some ways be easier to play since you are putting a slur in the right hand. But I just don't think it's actually what Mozart would have wanted, since in that time period, non-legato was actually the default articulation, not legato. Legato becomes the default articulation later, but not yet. In addition to this, I'm so used to hearing Baroque cellists play, and when a cellist plays a line like this, I'm used to hearing them play that with slightly detached bow strokes. So in my mind, that's the more musical way to play it. You do have to then talk with your student about slurring or moving that note smoothly into that note while your left hand is being more bouncy. And then they can both lift off at the end. All right, I have one more soapbox to talk about in this piece, and that is rhythm. I probably should have started with rhythm because I love starting with rhythm, but we're going to do it at the end here. The rhythms in this piece look very simple. We have half notes, quarter notes, eighth notes for most of the piece. But then there is one triplet thrown in here. And I find that students usually do not play it accurately as a true smooth triplet. It's of course in measure 7. The problem is that Mozart takes that little sequence, which has been 2/8 quarter, and then suddenly jams those 3 notes in there for a triplet. And most students, in my experience, tend to turn it into 2/16 plus an eighth note. So instead of doing evenly, it turns into. So my approach to doing this is twofold. First of all, I like to start my beginners by doing a lot of rhythmic work with movement in our bodies, clapping our hands, tapping our hands on our legs, saying syllables or words that go with rhythmic patterns way before they encounter them ever in a piece of music. So I'm building pulse and rhythmic subdivisions in them from day one in their lessons. But if we get to this piece and they're still struggling with it, then my best solution is to use fruit words, which you've probably heard in my other videos already. We do a lot of fruit for our triplets and eighth notes, or duples and triples in my studio, because I just find it's the easiest way to emphasize the correct thing. So for me, triplets are blueberry, and for this we can use apple for eighth notes. Students need to be able to, within a pulse, switch back and forth. Apple, apple, apple. Blueberry, blueberry, blueberry. Or you could use the actual rhythm here in measure 5, 6, and 7 and say apple, pear, pear, apple, pear, pear, blueberry, pear, pear. And what you don't want is blueberry, right? We don't want the emphasis on the last note of the triplet. It does not matter what words you use, as long as they are words that are very familiar, easy to pronounce, and put the emphasis on the correct syllable. That's why I like blueberry. That blue part of it is where the emphasis should go. So try it with your student. Try apple, pear, pear, apple, pear, pear, blueberry, pear, pear, and see if they can even that out. Of course, you can do the same thing with saying the words while you play the right hand there as well. But that is one typical problem that students frequently do not do accurately, is play that triplet rhythm. I hope that's given you a few ideas on how to teach this Mozart minuet. Again, if you have suggestions for pieces for me to do in an upcoming video, or composers or styles of pieces, I'd love to know what you'd like help with. Please subscribe to my channel, share this video with a friend, and I wish you all the best in your teaching.